For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul O'Brien, the Vice-Chancellor, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture by Professor Caroline Bainbridge, Professor of Culture and Psychoanalysis in Media, Culture and Language Department. And the title of her talk, you can see it on the telly there, is Media Objects, Emotion, Experience and the Psychopolitics of Popular Culture. I've just said to Caroline, I have no idea what psychopolitics is, but I suspect there's a lot of it about. Let me tell you a little bit about Caroline and her background. Some of you will know, but she studied modern and medieval languages at Cambridge, and then she did a Master in Psychoanalytic Studies at Sheffield, and stayed on to do her PhD there with a thesis on film, feminist theory and psychoanalysis. And more recently, I was interested to see she gained a second Master's in Consultation and Leading Organisations, Psychodynamic and Systemic Approaches with the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. Caroline's teaching career began at what is now Buckinghamshire New University. Then she moved for a spell to the University of East London, and then she joined us here at Roehampton in 2004. As a senior lecturer in media and cultural studies. She became a reader. Then in 2015 she became director of the university's graduate school, and in that same year I'm delighted to say that we were able to recognise her wonderful achievements by promoting her to a personal chair as Professor of Culture and Psychoanalysis. Caroline has established in really a very short period of time a truly outstanding reputation for the quality of her research. Her work's been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, by the British Academy, and her publications include monographs on Lars von Trier and another one on Luce Irigaray, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. Caroline is director of the Media and Inner World Research Network, which is an AHRC project, which she organises with Candida Yates of Bournemouth University, and Candida is here with us today. Caroline's also film section editor for the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and until recently was editor of the journal Free Associations. Also with Candida, she is series editor of the Psychoanalysis and Popular Culture book series by Karnak Books, and in addition to all of that, she is a very committed and dedicated teacher and popular supervisor, and is a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So I think we're very fortunate indeed to have Caroline as our colleague, and please welcome her onto the platform.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very generous introduction. And really, I'd like to start by thanking Paul for inviting me to give this lecture, and especially for inviting me to give it in this particular week, because it is actually 3 years this week since he called me with that great news that he was happy to approve my application to a chair. So the timing seems really very fitting. And it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about my work, so thanks everybody for coming along. As you'll have seen from the invitation that went round, I want to focus this evening on the role of popular media in everyday life and culture, and to do this by thinking about how we experience what I call media objects, and by this I mean things like TV, pop music, cinema, Netflix, and how we experience these things at a psychological level. Because I think that the way we interact with media has a lot of important consequences for the way that we think about our ideas of selfhood these days. And this also plays into how we understand our relationship to other people, as well as informing our understanding of broader social and cultural events. So I want to argue that thinking about how all of this works is really crucial if we're going to understand cultural politics, especially at a point in history when so much seems to be at stake, with the rise of the so-called new right, populism, and so on. But I am determined to try to stay positive, which is not always easy for a scholar of psychoanalysis. And some of you might remember, after all, that Sigmund Freud suggested that the whole point of psychoanalysis is to transform neurotic misery into common unhappiness. But I also want to try to show how our encounters with popular culture also provide important spaces for release and pleasure, as well as for working through emotional and psychological dilemmas. And that this, I think, is what helps us better to cope with the strangeness of the world and all its idiosyncrasies. So to begin with, of course, there is Freud. Writing in 1920, very shortly after the untimely death of his daughter Sophie, Freud formulated the idea of a compulsion to repeat. He watched his baby grandson called Ernst as he played with a cotton reel in his cot, and Ernst would repeatedly throw the reel out of the cot, holding on to the end of the thread, and he would shout, "Aw," as he did so. And then he'd pull it back in again, and he would exclaim, "Ah," as it came back to him. And Freud interpreted these sounds as the German word fort, which means gone, and da, which means, in this context at least, back again. And he argued that Ernst's game was really about trying to control the disappearance of his mother. So by making the cotton reel disappear and come back again magically, Ernst was trying to deal with the loss of his mother by magically restaging her appearance. And this gave Ernst the illusion of control. And Freud observed that the compulsion to repeat is often about a wish to find a way of mastering difficulty and finding a way of feeling as though control is in our hands, although often, of course, it isn't. This observation helped Freud to understand the role of anxiety and control in everyday life. And it also gives us tonight, I think, a basic example to hold in mind about how we depend on objects, both real ones and imagined ones, to explore our experience in the world. And of course, all of this was really timely as Freud was writing in 1920, and he was trying to make sense of the phenomenon of shell shock experienced by soldiers in World War I. But I did promise to try to remain positive, and so I want to change tack a little bit. And so there's also a very different kind of cultural icon, Prince, who importantly reminds us that I think you get the point. I recently had a really interesting object-led experience at the Prince exhibition at the O2, where I was invited to wear these white gloves to handle Prince's guitar, which was called Purple Tailor. And the guide took very great pleasure in announcing that we were allowed to keep these gloves as a memento because they had had physical contact with a guitar that had only ever been played by Prince. And more than that, that bore the indentations of his nails and actually traces of his sweat. This shows, I think, how objects are connected to one another in what I like to think of as a relay of links and associations. And these eventually, in this example, come to rest on a very particular artist, one who many of you know was very, very important to me and a great favourite of mine. And I'm sure I can't be alone in having a whole stock of media favourites to enjoy on a regular, sometimes seemingly endless repeat, whether it's watching It's a Wonderful Life at Christmas, or listening to 80s tracks with a good friend as you both get ready to go to a retro-inspired 50th birthday party, or singing Pen, Pineapple, Apple, Pen with your brother, or maybe dancing Gangnam Style, either in homage to K-pop or Strictly Come Dancing, or perhaps just because sometimes politicians do seem to have the wherewithal to take the mickey out of themselves. And I think there's a lot to suggest that we increasingly turn to media favourites as a source of consolation and pleasure as the world gets ever more ephemeral and seemingly empty of certainty and perennially reliable social and moral values. But I think we also turn to media to work out what we're feeling, or perhaps more accurately, to work through our unconscious responses to the world and its politics. And sometimes this isn't necessarily pretty. So these are the ideas that have been preoccupying me for some time now. And so I want tonight to try to set out some thoughts about contemporary media experience and what I think of as its psychopolitics. So we live today in a really media-saturated environment, and it's almost impossible for us to avoid multiple daily encounters with all kinds of media. I think our sense of identity is really intimately bound up with this. There's a little bit of a theoretical foray coming, so bear with me. Media scholars use various terms to describe this entanglement with everyday media. Referring to it as mediatization, Sonia Livingston suggests that today's media become meaningful because of coordinated human activity. And at the same time, people understand the world and their position in it through the media, she says. Other theorists, like John B. Thompson, use the term mediazation to describe how power relations and media experience coincide in everyday life. And yet another media scholar, Nick Holdry, suggests that we have to distinguish between what he calls mediation, which is something that is concerned with the effect of media institutions and their existence in the world, and mediatization, which he says is about the transformational power of media logic. Whatever terminology you want to use, though, I think it's really crucial to assume that media now play a largely naturalized and unnoticed role in everyday life. And if we agree with that provocation, then we need to think about the psychological consequences of this and how these impact on our sense of identity, cultural politics, and social dynamics. And I think this is especially important given the large number of fragilities around at the moment that seem to lead to very polarized enactments and expressions of fear and anxiety. So just think about the moment when anyone enacts a really heinous attack on someone else. This is the moment often at which their fear, anxiety, and pain is often most on show. And I think this gives us one way of trying to make sense of contemporary politics around the rise of the so-called alt-right, the election of Trump, and everything else that we come across on a daily basis in our news media. So my suggestion is that media are really now closely entwined with everyday life and everyday experiences of selfhood, and that they operate as key objects in both our external and internal worlds. Media provide us with channels for the uptake and output of emotional experience, and so they play a really important role in shaping our psychology. In other words, we use media, I think, as psychological objects to help us to manage an idea of who we are, but also to help us to understand how and why we enjoy relationships with other people. So these objects help us to explore both creative and destructive engagement with the world around us. And we see this in our everyday engagement with online culture in the shape of memes, for example. Perhaps you'll remember the very heated media debate about #TheDress, which was all over the media about a year ago. The debate was whether the colour combination in this dress was white and gold or blue and black. Now, the circulation of this meme was really quite intense. And as you can see you can't quite see the graph here, but this is a graph of interest, and you can see the spikes over 3 days. And you can see that most people were convinced that the dress was white and gold. Print media were also really quite obsessed with it, giving us loads of detailed scientific accounts of the hows and whys of colour perception. And eventually, the original dress was revealed to be blue and black, much against the expectations of many people. The meme was so successful that it generated its own sub-memes, and eventually was repurposed as an activist campaign against domestic violence, drawing out very different connotations of the blue and black debate. The seeming banality of memes is emptied out here, I think, and this allows new associations to the politics of fashion, bodies, and gendered experience. Politics get mapped onto the meme, but the idea here that the meaning of blue and black is difficult to see taps into broader unconscious silences about the visual world. And of course, right now, there's a very heated debate going on about the meaning of blue and black in the political context, as we witness an apparently banal and yet terribly heated debate about UK passport colours, and whether there has ever been such a thing as a black British passport. Well, I had one, I'm sure you did too. We could conjecture here that the debate is not so much about the real object in the external world, but one that's rather rooted in the politics of immigration that shaped the outcome of the Brexit referendum. the unconscious reference seems to be linked to an unconscious desire to deny the legitimacy of black British identity, I think. These are very worrying times. In my most recent work, I've started to formulate the idea of what I call a bruised aesthetic, one in which black and blue tones are used to communicate unspeakable experience. And an example of this is seen in the very wonderful French film called Girlhood, Bande de Filles in the original French, whose story is about a young black working class woman in Paris who joins a girl gang in pursuit of a sense of togetherness and as a way of trying to discover a sense of identity on her own terms. Now, there's a psychoanalyst called Donald Meltzer who argues that there is such a thing as a girl gang state of mind. And he says that the girl gang state of mind shows how the struggle for equality is based on a refusal of authority of the father, and it creates what he calls an anti-masculine Amazonian quality in which the myth of feminine inferiority is really vigorously denied. Meltzer links this to what he calls the injustice of the social order, where femininity is not in itself obviously valued. And I think this is shown in Girlhood in the really marvellous scene when the gang uses its hard-won money to pay for a night in a hotel room so that they can dance together in stolen dresses. And I just need to give a quick aside here about the politics of lighting and the fact that our own projection setup is going to make this clip quite difficult to see. I'll say more about it in a moment. Favourite clips from recent years in cinema. And one of the things that I think is going on with this idea of the bruised aesthetic here is at work on several levels, I think, and all of these express a political idea of some shape or form. So firstly, this scene hinges on a moment of relief for these young women from the psychological pain of trying to grow up in the Parisian suburbs as young, poor black women who are really disenfranchised. Secondly, in a way that's echoed in the lighting set up in the room, it also shows how cinema can do a really good job of depicting black skin on the screen, overturning the history of technological constraints around cinematic lighting practices. And thirdly, it shows us how young women find solace and possibility in the things that bind them together. Note in this clip that we first hear Rihanna's song on the soundtrack, and then there's a shift to us hearing the young women singing along in their own voices. And I think this simultaneously disrupts and helps to reinforce our identifications with these characters, making us realise how we ourselves are touched by the scene and how it speaks to our real-world experience, and of course that of Rihanna with all of her personal histories of trauma. So the girls sing whilst not being heard and are ventriloquising, and they therefore are giving rise to what I think of as a kind of karaoke rendition of identity, evoking their poignant search for voices of their own. So the bruised aesthetic, I think, reveals pain and pleasure and possibility all at once, showing the psychopolitics of popular culture to be really deeply complex. Now, at a time when traditional notions of community are falling into disarray, or at least seem to be, media offer us a way of making links with one another and with particular aspects of ideology. But they also give us a way of disrupting these social links, as we see in news stories about Russian interference in elections and things. So our entanglements with media culture are often very rich and complex, but they're always rather intimate. We do, after all, carry our media objects in our pockets, on our phones, freely watching on demand or sharing whenever we feel like it. So I'm really interested in how we use media for the purposes of consolation and emotional work. And in this respect, the idea that we now live in a therapeutic age, is important for my arguments. So this is where psychoanalysis comes in. But unlike scholars in the 1970s and 80s, who relied on the work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, I turned to the British object relations school of psychoanalysis, and particularly to the work of Donald Woods Winnicott, I'm garbling all of that, and Christopher Bollas. Now, these psychoanalysts are really interested in how the environment we live in influences our emotion and psychological development. And the theories that they offer allow us to think creatively about the very often messy, slippery, sometimes contradictory, often rather conflicted responses that we have both to other people and to the world at large. Another foray into theory, please bear with me. In the British object relations psychoanalytic tradition, the idea of the object is rather particular. It doesn't refer to an inanimate thing in the usual sense of the word, but instead is used to explain how the emotional ways that we feel related to people and things is central in a development of the sense of who we are. So when we encounter someone or something in the real external world, for example, a sibling or a work of art, we internalize in our minds a version of them. And we make use of these psychological objects to explore the whole range of emotional experience that shapes our relationship to them. So psychological objects operate at the level of fantasy, and they help us to sustain a sense of still being related to meaningful others and things, even when they're not there. So having these internal objects is really important for our capacity to negotiate the very tricky work of developing a robust sense of self. And Donald Winnicott observed that certain objects enjoy a particularly treasured status. He called them transitional objects, and he argued that these help us to develop our human capacity for play and creativity. Now, my own transitional object was a giant Bugs Bunny, who got lost in the shopping centre at Marion Square, leaving me inconsolable, aged about 2. And this trailer for a Peanuts cartoon shows us something about how commonplace this experience and relationship is.
The wait is over. The world's most beloved comic strip comes to life.
This is it! Give me back my blanket! No, this is the start you need to break the habit.
In an all-new original Peanuts movie.
You and that stupid blanket.
Linus's friends think blankets are for babies.
Linus, no future husband of mine is going to sit around holding a blanket.
I'm not your future husband, and I don't really care if you like me or not.
But sometimes growing up
I need my blanket! I admit it!
means standing up for what makes you happy.
If I were you, I would be afraid of what the other kids would say about that blanket.
Do you have anything in your pocket you can throw into the air? They don't say much.
Happiness is a warm blanket, Charlie Brown. Look for it on Blu-ray and DVD.
I don't need this blanket. I can throw it away anytime I want to.
Yes, Winnicott argues that we look for substitutes for these transitional objects as we mature through life, and this gives us one way of understanding how and why things like music, TV, cinema, art, cake, and I think in my own life, gin, can take on significance for us even as adults. But Winnicott also emphasises the important difference between the way that we use an object and the way that we relate to it. So he suggests that in object relating, certain alterations take place in the self. So the object becomes meaningful. In other words, when we relate to an object, it provides a way for us to enrich our sense of self. So the object can fill up spaces of emptiness that we feel inside and compensate for what we think might be missing. We introject it and we make it part of ourselves. Or we use an object as a way of getting rid of something that's particularly unpleasant that we no longer wish to feel. So we project aggression, envy, and we make ourselves feel cleaner as a result. We relate to the object through these mechanisms and processes of projection, introjection, and identification, and all of this happens unconsciously whether we like it or not. So when it comes to using objects, though, things are a bit different. So to use an object, Winnicott says, we need to take account of the nature and behaviour of the object as an independent entity. So the object is both incorporated and taken in, but also recognised as being outside us and outside our control. So it's recognised as an external phenomenon. And so therefore it can tolerate being destroyed. So in fantasy we can destroy the object, but nevertheless it persists and survives. And this kind of object allows us to develop a stronger capacity to live. Because the object is able to survive being destroyed, we feel it's more real and dependable, and we can use it more effectively. I don't want to get bogged down in the nuances of the theory here, but I think this idea is really useful when it comes to trying to understand a heavily mediated and yet very fragile age, an age in which our sense of identity is often in question, if not actually in conflict of some kind. Now, using an object provides a way of shoring up our fractured sense of identity. Writing in 1994, the late Roger Silverstone argued that television worked as a kind of transitional object. He said it helps us to negotiate anxiety in everyday life, and gives us room to appreciate creativity and to think about what we see and feel as a result of the images on screen. I want to go a bit further than this and to think about how media broadly now emotionalise our everyday experience, but also provide us with a channel for feelings, how they media allow us to play with them, to manipulate or repurpose them for our own psychological benefit. And I think psychoanalysis provides important expertise when it comes to this kind of conflicted and contradictory experience, because this, after all, is the very stuff of the unconscious in the consulting room. Psychoanalysis also focuses on holding seemingly impossible ideas in tension with one another, so that our difficulties and challenges can be understood. And it seems to me that it's therefore really important to stage a return to psychoanalytic thinking in my discipline. I'd like to do a quick audience poll here, if I may, and you'll indulge me. How many of you have watched Mamma Mia? I knew there was a reason I loved you all so much. For those of you who don't know, you're missing out, you need to get it quick. Mamma Mia is both a stage show and a film whose love story is loosely contrived around the pop songs of ABBA. What's not to like? As a cultural phenomenon, the Mamma Mia stage show and film is really notable for its staggering global success and its particular appeal to female audiences. And fans around the world regularly attend repeat screenings. It's that good. Some of which are actually specialised sing-along events. And I've got a little clip to give you a flavour of what these are like.
Mamma mia, here I go again. My, how can I resist you?
Have you seen the film before?
Yes! This will be my 13th.
It's my 10 times. 10. It's just joyous. It brings light and just enthusiasm to this freezing cold makes it summer.
Everybody knows the lyrics and all of us we have been dancing with Mamma Mia, not with ABBA, our whole entire lives.
I'm in London's Leicester Square Tube and this is the back of the queue for the sing-along Mamma Mia.
My, just how much I missed you. Yes, I've been broken hearted, blue since the day we parted. Why did I ever let you go?
Can we have the music, please?
I just want to know, is this her full-time job?
And the first moment is for the first moment is for Dancing Queen, okay? As soon as
The film's just about to start. I have my goodie bag with my glow stick and my party popper.
And when you get the chance, you are the dancing queen, young and sweet, only 17. Dancing queen, you love me on the tambourine, oh yeah. You can dance, you can shine, having the time of your life. Ooh, see that girl, watch that scene, singing the dancing queen.
Well, I'm not an ABBA fan, but being with all these women and singing ABBA songs, that's great.
Okay, so as well as enjoying huge box office success, this film became the fastest and biggest selling DVD in the UK, selling more than 5 million copies with estimated ownership in 1 in 4 homes. So DVD ownership, of course, is also about allowing fans to watch the film again and again with different groups of people, sharing it between them. And as I mentioned earlier on, the film has a really particular substantial female fandom, and media coverage of its success largely attributes this to the fact that, as a film about the romantic tribulations of a trio of female friends and one of their daughters, the story taps into fairly standard rom-com themes. But the press were really also interested and paid a lot of attention to the fact that both the stage show and the film were devised and directed by a trio of women. And journalists often drew comparisons between the production team and the three main characters. Mamma Mia was celebrated for its evocation of female friendship, something that is really at work in that clip that I've just shown you from the sing-along event. But the success of Mamma Mia is, I think, really very much about ABBA songs and the use of ABBA songs, and the way that ABBA songs also deal with emotional life experience. Now, the psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas suggests that we endow our objects with feelings. We use them according to how we feel in any particular moment. So he says that objects store up aspects of what he calls our self-experience, and this comes out later on if we encounter these objects in unexpected, unfamiliar places. Think of the example of diamonds from Rihanna that I mentioned earlier on here. Now, Bollas describes these objects as mnemic, and in Mamma Mia, I think the ABBA songs are mnemic objects. Depending on our associations to these songs, and we've all got them, they unexpectedly remind us of past moments of our own lives, often rather emotional ones. We always hear ABBA at weddings, for instance. But the music and this revisiting of emotional experience shapes our response to the film, I think, and is one of the reasons that it is so beloved. The songs allow us to revisit aspects of our lives, but the music also opens up a shared space because we see other people also having their own emotional responses to the film. And the songs themselves, which deal with the stuff of relationships and feelings, come to stand in for our own feelings, for our significant others, or what psychoanalysis refers to as relatedness. So with its clever deployment of emotion through song and music, and its established appeal to women, I want to suggest that Mamma Mia articulates something really important about femininity. It allows female fans to forge new relationships and friendships with other people on the basis of their shared love of Mamma Mia and the emotional work it allows them to do. So if you like, Mamma Mia creates a kind of knowing me, knowing you. And at the time of its release, this really resounded with the possibility of forging empathy between women at a moment when popular gender politics were really caught up in the logic of neoliberalism and all the invitations implicit in that into hyper-femininity. So this shared use of a media object allows political experience to coalesce with a new sense of selfhood and community, I think. And this is a clear example of object relating to go back to Winnicott. But Mamma Mia also has been an object of denigration and ridicule. It's an emblem of low culture that's with a particularly feminine emphasis, and so this often makes it seem to be the lowest of the low when it comes to popular culture. And this, I think, also means that it's an object that we can use in Winnicott's sense. So our use of Mamma Mia creates room for us to do different things at a psychological level. We might have to put up with reading really disparaging comments about something that we really love, but nevertheless we can hold on to our joy about that in the face of them. It's like sticking up the finger, flicking the bird to the critics. So knowing me, knowing you takes on a different nuance here and provides us with an interesting structure of feeling. And I think this is one that clearly persists some 10 years after the release of the movie. This month sees the new ABBA exhibition opening at the South Bank Centre. And for those of you who know your London geography, I am resisting the opportunity to make a very bad joke about facing our Waterloo. And the film sequel called Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again will be released later on in the year too. So it'll be really interesting to monitor the press reception of both these media events, given the widely reported surge of interest in feminism and the prominence of women-led movies that are around at the moment. Psychopolitics, I think, are on the move, revealing something perhaps of how object relating and object usage can and do impact on the lived materiality of our lives, as well as on our psychological experiences. ABBA's invitation to see that girl, watch that scene, seems really prescient here. I've begun to touch on the importance of media objects in shaping changes to cultural politics, and this is a theme that I've used to explore aspects of the globally successful TV show In Treatment. This show started out life in Israel, where it was called Bay Tipul. And in 2008, the American production house HBO bought the series and remade it in a way that more or less entirely kept faith with the original screenplays written for the Israeli version by Haggai Levy. The US version has Gabriel Byrne playing psychotherapist Paul Watson, and the central conceit of the show is to give us insight into his work with different patients on the couch and with his own supervisor. Only one storyline in the entire first two series is changed, and this in the US version as compared to the Israeli original. In Israel, Bay Tippel's story of Yadin, a pilot who drops a bomb over Gaza and kills 13 children, had huge political ramifications because it was based on a true story. In the US, this storyline was seen as the most difficult to transpose culturally, and in the end it was replaced with the story of Alex, an African-American Navy pilot who drops a bomb instead on a madrasa in Iraq. Now, the different political scenarios at the heart of this change in the narrative are really complex and telling, and I think they give us insight into the political and cultural concerns that dominated in the respective nation states at the time of broadcast. When we think about the decision to change this storyline, we need to contemplate the fantasies of American identity that it evokes. These are related firstly to imperial power, but also to democratic forces for change and issues of moral and cultural responsibility arising from the so-called war on terror, which was alive and well in the cultural imagination and on the news agenda at the time when the series was broadcast. And of course, the idea of American identity is really complex when it comes to issues such as race, ethnicity, and cultural difference. And all of this gets condensed in the figure of Alex, played by Blair Underwood, so that it becomes all too apparent for viewers on the living room couch what's going on in terms of a displacement of the American warmongering imperative onto a black man. In the US version, Alex ends up dying in action after he is returned to flying for the Navy in an effort to make good for his past deeds. And this taps into many really complex aspects of US history, cultural politics, and identity. For American viewers, perhaps, it invites self-reflection and active working through of guilt around the American role in the Gulf War and other wars. And for viewers in other countries where the US version was screened, we might ponder what we think of in our collective imaginations as America, and what these fantasies mean for us as we try to deal with our own national place in global relations. So symptomatically, I think In Treatment offers us a barometer of public feeling about the effect of America's decision to go to war in Iraq in response to the attacks on the World Trade Center and elsewhere in 2001. The public mood of disinclination for the war, which gathered momentum throughout the noughties, and its ongoing consequences for the so-called American way of life, are given an outlet through this TV drama. And in choosing to reframe this particular story as one about Iraq, rather than exploring the role of the US in relation to the ongoing conflict in Gaza, there's also a cultural silencing, a refusal of responsibility that affects the way that we watch the programme and respond to its widespread critical acclaim. This silencing, I think, also taps into feelings of guilt and responsibility evoked by the war and by foreign policy more broadly. And I think it's really interesting that some countries didn't get to see the US version. Instead, local versions were made by HBO. This is not the case in the UK. We saw the American version. But viewers in 16 other countries, including Argentina, the Netherlands, Brazil, Japan, Russia, and Serbia, saw their own local version of the story. So I think this suggests that there's something really important going on around the idea of America in our collective psyches, revealing the psychological links between politics and the global flow of television. The therapeutic potential of television also comes to light here, I think, resonating with our more recent excursions into politically astute television drama. And I'm thinking here especially of the marvellous Handmaid's Tale and its extraordinarily timely adaptation, and the way its themes speak to both contemporary anxiety about the rise of the new right and the collapse of liberal moral and social values, as well as the paradoxical shift toward declaiming politically and socially reprehensible behaviours, such as those being revealed in the #MeToo campaign across so many sectors of our culture and society. Nolite te bastades car barundum, as June observes, showing how television can mobilise political sensibilities by enacting symptomatic resistances and creating psychic intensities, to use a phrase from Christopher Bollas's writing. Feeling sets and political ideas get condensed in our on-screen objects that we store away as reference points for our own experience, showing how TV drama provides us with objects that we can use to regulate our own emotional and psychological lives. When our on-screen fictions reflect social and cultural dilemmas, we find ways of bringing to the surface tensions and anxieties that might otherwise be quite difficult to access. And popular culture allows us to do this en masse as a social group. Bolus uses the phrase cracking up to show how we fragment our own experience while projecting it into these objects. And he says that this frees up psychological room for us to name the issues involved. And so this structure of relating seems to be really important, and indeed seems to be in the ascendant at this moment in time, as psychopolitics begin to effect change in our ideological spaces. In this fashioning of media as objects of our inner world, then, mediatization becomes a really important process through which we can negotiate the complexities and contradictions of contemporary life. And yet, in the context of our increasingly fragmented sense of our identity in society, our capacity to establish sustainable experiences of relatedness breaks down, and we become more dependent on the mediated environment for a sense of who we are. This theme of relatedness brings me to a more personal and localized example in which I'd like to make reference to the work of some young filmmakers who are here this evening. Some of you may have encountered the TV films made by the Chacksfield brothers, but I would like to bring in an example from one of their first pieces of work, a short family-based documentary.
It's about... Have you got a favourite TV show?
Favourite TV show? Ant and Dec.
In showing this clip, I'm trying reflexively to enact my own uses of media to strengthen relatedness. I was the camera person in this clip, and the interviewee is my dad. Grandad to Ewan and Ben, the directors and interviewers, who are, of course, my nephews. And in bringing this footage into this lecture, I'm highlighting my dad's very present absence at tonight's event, where he would have been so thrilled to be here. I'm also signalling the sadness around his loss, and the way that little clips of video can sustain a sense of relatedness and connection, despite the sometimes overwhelming emotional experience that loss always brings. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to my dad's memory, and to express my very deep love and gratitude to my whole family, Mum, Nikki, Ed and the boys, for their support and the support that they unquestioningly give to me. I'd also like to thank my godmother, Sandy, for being here this evening, my godson, Archie, also being here. There's something generational going on there, and my supervisor, Sue Weiss, who I'm delighted to have here this evening. I'd also like in this very brief excursion to say a warm and hearty thank you to my wonderful friends across the university, but especially to those of you in MCL. Your collegiality and good humour make Roehampton such a great place to be. Of course, I also want to thank friends and other visitors here this evening from so many different parts and periods of my life for being here. It means so very much. There's another reason, though, for me choosing to include this clip, and this is because it shows how relatedness also taps into the psychopolitics of popular culture. My dad's choice of Ant and Dec here as a personal favourite tells us not just about his desire to make his grandsons chuckle and to share something that they enjoyed with him, it also speaks to our experience of terrestrial television and Saturday night programming in creating an ideology of family life. And I think this is especially important and interesting given that audience research tells us that watching TV is an increasingly isolated pursuit thanks to the role of things like tablets and laptops in everyday life. So more broadly, this example, I think, taps into the celebrification of contemporary popular culture and into structures of identification and feeling that this affords for viewers and consumers. The psychological pressures of celebrity culture are condensed in the example of Ant and Dec, of course, each of whom has recently shared their experience of Ant's mental ill health problems. Now, the capacity of these very successful men to disclose this emotional experience speaks to a really burgeoning awareness of mental health that's abroad in popular culture, highlighting the travails of young men and the difficulties of ensuring access to appropriate channels of self-referral and sufficient psychological capital to ensure that emotional obstacles to seeking help can be overcome. This is one of the most pressing social issues of the day, and the revelations made by Ant help us to understand how celebrity culture and its apparent obsession with personal disclosure can also lead to a deepening sense of relatedness through identification, and in turn this helps to promote services available to vulnerable people. At a still broader level of analysis, though, we can also suggest that Ant McPartlin becomes an emblem of the vulnerability of a very particular ideological formation of white privileged heterosexual masculinity. The collapse of faith in moral and social values that I mentioned earlier on also echoes through our cultural and ideological apparatuses, and pop culture plays a really important role in bringing these to light. I have in mind here the increasing use of on-demand viewing of television, for example, which fuels the phenomenon, of which I have to confess I am guilty, of so-called binge watching. TV scholar Charlotte Brunsden argues that the idea of binging television is linked to old arguments that TV is a dangerous and addictive medium. And she reminds us that this verb to binge, with all its connotations of an uncontrollable, excessive consumption, ironically reconnects the prestige dramas with the addiction metaphors that have always been used to characterize the consumption of TV. In some of my recent work, I've been thinking about how greed is often a theme of the dramas that we choose to binge on. Think, for example, of Walter White in Breaking Bad, whose insatiable greed is apparently driven by a desire to provide for his family, a conceit, of course, that eventually unravels and leads to his downfall, but that provides us with a really great metaphor for the impact of the financial crash that was playing out as this drama aired on TV. And a metaphor also for the collapse of trust in social and political and cultural institutions devised by patriarchy. Or think alternatively of Betty Draper in Mad Men, whose greed is put on show via her body as she gains and loses weight, perhaps reflecting her deep unhappiness as a woman trapped in an old-fashioned culture of femininity that predated the arrival of second-wave feminism. Watching ideas of greed on screen, I think, is about a contemporary experience of emptiness, driven by technological change in the digital era. For all our apparent connectedness online, studies show an exponential rise in reports of loneliness, and notions of community have migrated away from the streets and into the virtual domain. There's also a link to shifting patterns of relatedness across the public body, something that discussions of media consumption often focus on. Newspapers warn us about the plague of narcissism caused by social media, and our love of personal mobile devices is often seen to distract from family relatedness in the home, largely because of viewing habits that involve so-called multi-screening practices. So people are on their phones and tablets, often having virtual conversations with people on things like Twitter, at the same time as watching TV, or perhaps not watching it properly enough. So relatedness is now imagined in the ether rather than something that's lived in reality for many people, conjuring up what Sherry Turkle calls being alone together. And I think this sense of emptiness gives rise to a greed that gets displaced into the kind of viewing activity we think of as binge watching. So our appetite for watching media made for much larger screens on tiny handheld devices that we can stick in our pockets also creates the illusion that the coveted object belongs to us, allowing us to consume wherever and whenever we want. As Carol Vanellis puts it, it's media sublime. At the same time, though, binge watching ironically also sustains relatedness in an era when loneliness is never far from the headlines. Take the so-called Netflix and chill phenomenon, for example, in which watching box sets together is now meant to be the new date night. Think, too, of the emerging etiquette of couple behaviour around the shared viewing of box sets. If you decide to watch the next episode while your beloved is out for the evening, then this is seen as a bit of a rebuff, to say the least. Binge watching, then, can bring people into contact with others watching in the same room, watching the same thing, whether they're in the same room or in the virtual spaces of social media. So the glow of TV drama provides reassurance and containment, but it also gives us an outlet for the greed that comes from desperately seeking stuff to make us feel good again. TV becomes a very different kind of object here, one that chimes with Bullus's idea of the transformational object. Now, for Bullus, the transformational object is linked to the very earliest relationship with our mothers, and it's all about emotional intensity. He says that the transformational object seduces us, promises transformation, and Bolus gives examples of advertising and religion. I think intense experience is absolutely central to binge watching. We often feel compelled to keep watching long into the night, regardless of what meeting we may have with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at 9 a.m. the next day. And streaming services like Netflix encourage this through features like autoplay, which I note has recently been adopted by iPlayer too. Bolus identifies gambling as compulsive and transformational, and I think we can see how binge watching seems to be quite similar. We seem to be looking for a way out of complex anxieties thrown up by life in the digital era, I think, with all its uncertainty. And I think of this mentality as the box set mindset. I think it tells us a great deal about what it means to be alive during a period of profound social and political change. Whatever we think of the phenomenon of binge watching, the compulsive desire to consume alerts us to what's missing in the experience of digital lives, but it also provides us with a way to come together again. So a psychoanalytic approach allows us to understand this and to get to grips with the challenges and opportunities of digital experience and to feast on the possibilities, whether they're good for us or not. By thinking about the relationship between media and the inner world, I think we can find new perspectives on the usefulness of psychoanalytic approaches for media and cultural studies. Psychoanalysis has been out of fashion in my discipline for a very long time, but as Lynn Layton and Peter Redman have recently observed, it still has unique potential for opening up our thinking about the world. Psychoanalysis doesn't just give us a way of understanding how and why we resist what might seem to be good for us, or explain how we get pulled into irrational, destructive behaviour. It also gives us tools to help us think about what it means to be human and how we might survive and even thrive. This perspective encapsulates my passion for the value of psychoanalytic media studies, and I hope you may have found some food for thought in the examples that I have given. Thank you.
Well, Caroline, I think you could tell from that applause that we all enjoyed that very much, and I thought it was a incredibly interesting and thought-provoking lecture, and the way we connected Winnicott and Freud to Mamma Mia sing-alongs and Anton Deck was really quite extraordinary, and it made some very complex ideas become very accessible in some way. It made me really aware of some of the deeper currents that are obviously running beneath the culture that we live in our everyday lives in, and shed some really great insights into critical issues like identity and cohesion and division and isolation. So thank you very much for that, Caroline. Those of you who know these occasions know that we don't take questions, but we invite a distinguished colleague from another university, and I'm very pleased to have Professor Candida Yates from Bournemouth University to respond on our behalf. Candida.
Thank you. Okay. I'm delighted to be invited to respond to Professor Caroline Bainbridge's excellent inaugural lecture, which so beautifully presents her approach to the psychopolitics of media and popular culture in everyday life. Caroline's work builds on previous psychoanalytic theories of culture and the unconscious to create a new conceptual framework through which to understand our experience of media and the use of its objects in the contemporary media age. In so doing, as we've seen tonight, Caroline skillfully unpacks the different layers or levels of experience, which include the structures of history and society, the experience of selfhood, and the affective processes of unconscious fantasy. And it is these different registers of experience which sort of interweave and come together and which shape and transform our political relationship to media objects at any one time. Psychopolitical and cultural studies of media have often focused on the tensions of using media as a kind of vacuous escape or retreat. in psychoanalytic studies of media, and of social media in particular, it is often accounts of narcissistic pathology that dominate. By contrast, Caroline's psychocultural approach, which, while taking account, as we've seen, of the pathologies of media and of mediatization, her approach also allows us to go beyond the negative pathologization of media use and instead explore the complex ways that media objects, as in the film Mamma Mia, can, in a meaningful way, contribute to the emotional and political shaping of subjectivity, which includes the unconscious working through of affective experience. The skill and creativity and originality of Caroline's research is to take old and established theories and shake them up to produce a more nuanced and complex approach that allows us to address the psychopolitical and cultural dilemmas of the current age. The notion that there is a close relationship between media, culture, and political struggle is one that's well established in cultural studies. Yet, as Caroline says, today, as in the rise of the alt-right, or rather the far-right, for example, and also, I think importantly, in the resistance to it, a critical psychoanalytic reading of cultural politics and its affective dynamics takes on a new urgency. As she says, we need to understand better the seemingly irrational, unconscious identifications that are often made in relation to different political positions, and a relational understanding of the media objects through which they are communicated. The kind of creative processes that Caroline discusses in relation to the theories of Winnicott and Bollas are reflected in her own academic practice as a psychoanalytic feminist and cultural studies scholar who, as we've seen tonight, plays with ideas and creates transitional spaces through which to communicate those ideas to others. Feminism has always been really important to Caroline, and her feminism was shaped during her days, I think, as an undergraduate at Girton College, Cambridge, which was first established as a ladies' college in the 19th century before being made a university the following century, but by notable feminists such as Emily Davies and Barbara Bodekin. Caroline channeled both their scholarly and feminist spirit as an active campaigner, as in her energetic contribution to Off the Shelf campaign, and through her interest in social justice for women, and through wanting to understand and unpack the contradictions and meanings of femininity, difference, and language. It was also at Cambridge that Caroline encountered psychoanalysis, and this was through the renowned scholar Elizabeth Wright. And she developed this interest at Sheffield as an MA and then a PhD student, where she researched the work of rigori, women, and film. These concerns came together in her wonderful prize-winning first monograph of feminine cinematics, Lucy Rigori, Women and Film, published by Palgrave. And if you've not read it, I really recommend it. I turn to it all the time, actually. It's really the place to go if you want to understand the work of Rigori. Caroline went on to develop some of those themes in her subsequent book on Lars von Trier, and also in numerous articles, edited anthologies, and journal special editions. Now, I first met Caroline, I think it was 2001, when she came to work at the University of East London in the psychosocial studies area. And I've since got to know her as a close friend and as a research partner on various projects, including the AHRC Media and Inner World Research Project, where she developed some of the ideas discussed tonight. An important aspect of that network was to create a dialogue between clinical psychoanalysis, academia, and media practice, and she's continued to do that in her role as a fellow of the College of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which is quite amazing, because Caroline is not a clinician, and there she is, she's been honoured with this, which is really quite something, and through her role as editor for the film section of that journal. Her role as editor on the journal Free Associations and on our new book series, Psychoanalysis and Popular Culture, also represents a continuation of that dialogue between academic, clinical, and media practice in the field of psychoanalysis. Like many others here, I can testify to Caroline's analytic and emotional intelligence, her creativity, capacity for really hard work, her kindness, empathy, playfulness, resilience, fun, and grit, all qualities that have played a role in the rise of her academic career and which make her such an excellent colleague and professor and role model for many young women and early career researchers. Caroline is a beloved teacher, and her lectures on psychoanalysis and media are talked about by students long after they leave. When I first went to Bournemouth University about 2 years ago, one of the administrators in the research department came up to me and said, "Oh, do you know Caroline Bainbridge? I used to be at Roehampton on her course. It was fantastic. We all loved it when she brought in that Freud doll, and we used to talk about totem and taboo and things." And, you know, you're still talked about after when people leave. So, to finish, it seems fitting to quote Virginia Woolf, who said, "Some people go to priests, others to poetry. I go to my friends," which, as we've seen tonight, is a motif that is echoed through the relational themes in Caroline's work, and also through her extensive professional networks and friendship circle, many of whom, alongside her wonderful and supportive family, are here this evening. Like others, I have so much to thank Caroline for, both in the context of our friendship and in our work together as colleagues. I'm so pleased to be part of this event, which publicly acknowledges the brilliant success of Caroline's journey as an academic and of her appointment as Professor of Psychoanalysis and Culture at this university. All that remains then is for us to give Professor Caroline Bainbridge a huge round of applause for all her achievements and for her success tonight.